This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Good evening and welcome. We live in a time of unparalleled wealth. Life has never been more comfortable or more convenient, but at what cost? We're here tonight because we know there's a problem and we can do something about it. Let's pause for a minute and consider our position here in Western Australia. The Sustainable Cities Index, compiled by the Australian Conservation Foundation, ranks Perth as the country's least sustainable city across 15 key indicators, including ecological footprint, biodiversity, climate change readiness, and household debt, to name a few. Having weathered the storm of a major global financial crisis relatively unscathed, WA is on the brink of another resource boom that will generate the kind of fiscal wealth that many of us will simply never see again. The question is, what will we do with this wealth? What will be our legacy? Will we invest in renewable energy, or will we continue to build coal-fired power stations? Will we finally agree to put a price on carbon, or will we continue to leave it for someone else to sort out? Will we transform Perth into a leading example of a water-sensitive city with state-of-the-art water recycling, appropriate landscapes, and a thriving water conservation industry sector? Or will we continue to rely on desalination and tap into ancient aquifers? Will we connect our city with a world-class public transport system and establish local food production systems in preparation for peak oil, or will we wait for the oil to run out? We have access to more information than ever before, faster than ever before, and we know what the problems are. We even know how to fix most of them. So what is stopping us? Tonight, we will hear an important message from one of the 21st century's most respected elders, and arguably the greatest environmentalist of our age. David Suzuki is an eminent scientist, a prolific author and broadcaster, and a passionate and highly effective communicator. As a world leader in sustainable ecology, David has literally spent a lifetime exploring, researching, and explaining the complexity and fragility of the natural world and our role in it. He offers a unique insight into the problems we face and makes a clear call for action. My final question to you this evening is this: will we choose to listen to our elders and acknowledge their wisdom, or will we continue to think that we know best? At the conclusion of David's lecture, he will take questions from the audience, which can be delivered from the microphones in the aisles. If you're inspired to ask a question, please get into position at the end of his address and keep them succinct. Can I also ask that you switch off your mobile phones and remind you that filming and photography is not permitted. Now we can get underway.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out this evening. It's always a delight to come to Perth because I've always had a response like this, thanks to UWA Extension, who put on these programs, and I'm so happy to be back here. In many universities, there's a tradition whereby an esteemed or an eminent professor at the end of her or his career is asked to deliver a last lecture, a summation of a lifetime of scholarship to present to the university audience. I taught at the University of British Columbia for 39 years. They never asked me to give one of those. But when I was asked to be part of a film for release in theaters, I One of the decisions was for me to give a last lecture, which I did in December of last year. And that forms part of the film, and it's what I'd like to offer to you this evening. I'm 74 years old. My next birthday will be in March. And you know, once you get past 70, there's no denying the reality. You're really old. I keep saying that I'm now in the death zone. There's nothing morbid about that. We're all going to die. I'm sorry to tell you that. And I think that as an elder now, I have to get on with the most important part of my life. You see, I believe it's our duty as elders to reflect back over a life, to sift through the details of that life, experiences and thoughts, to see whether there is a legacy to pass on. A few months ago, a reporter in Canada asked me, well, what would I like people to say about me after I'm gone? And I was stunned by the question. I said, after I'm dead, I couldn't give a shit what they say about me. I'll be dead. Why would I care? But what I would like is, while I'm still kicking, to offer some food for thought, something that I hope will be discussed after I'm gone. You see, elders can offer something without a hidden agenda of a desire for power, for fame, or for money. We can now speak the truth that comes from our hearts. And I hope that in speaking, I will prompt each of you to reflect on your own lives. Even if you're still a young person, you have to ask the question, what is life all about? What matters most to me? What brings me joy and happiness? What do I hope my legacy will be at the end of my life? I spent 30 years as a geneticist, and one of the most astounding things to me has been the way that scientists have accumulated techniques, methodology to analyze DNA, the genetic material. And in 2001, geneticists announced the completion of the Human Genome Project, the delineation of all 3 billion letters in the DNA of a single human nucleus. It was an astounding achievement. And to me, the most incredible insight that came from the Human Genome Project was a revelation that 99% of the genes in our cells are identical to the genes in chimpanzees. They are our nearest relatives. The revelation that each of us carries tens of thousands of genes identical to the genes in our pet dogs and cats, identical to the genes in eagles, salmon, fruit flies, dandelions, and cedar trees. All of life is related to us through a common evolutionary history. And surely if the rest of creation is our relatives, they deserve to be treated with greater respect and care than if we simply regard them as resources, as pests, as weeds, or vermin. And in an act of incredible generosity, the web of living things that are our relatives create, cleanse, and replenish the most fundamental needs that we have as animals. It was plants that created the oxygen-rich atmosphere that we depend on for our very existence. Before there were plants and photosynthesis, there was no oxygen in the air, because oxygen is a very reactive element, and as soon as it appeared, it would react and disappear from the air. Over millions of years, plants created the oxygen-rich atmosphere we depend on. Life is a critical part of the hydrologic cycle. The first science lesson I remember from grade school was that water covers 70% of the planet, evaporates, forms clouds, rains on the land, runs into rivers and lakes, evaporates. And life is a critical part of that hydrologic cycle. In Vancouver, I believe we have the best water in the world. Why? We get our water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. And when that rain hits the ground, the tree roots and the other plant roots and soil fungi and bacteria filter the water so animals like us can drink it. And every bit of our food that we eat for our nutrition to create our bodies was once alive. Life is the very nutrition we depend on. And all of the energy in our bodies that we need to grow and move and reproduce. All of that energy is sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis that we then exploit. So the point is that the web of living things that scientists call biodiversity, that I call our living relatives, create the fundamental needs that we as animals require to stay healthy and alive. We boast that we are intelligent. Oh, we're a clever animal. But what intelligent creature, knowing the role that air, water, soil, photosynthesis, and biodiversity play in our lives, would then proceed to deliberately and so thoughtlessly pour our most toxic chemicals onto these things, destroy ecosystems and habitat, and drive species to extinction as if it's our God-given right, and that in so doing, it won't affect us. Scientists can also use DNA in very clever ways to trace the movement of humanity across the planet. And all of the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. I can't wait to be invited by the Ku Klux Klan in the United States to give a lecture on genetics. And I will show those pointy-headed characters that we are all Africans, because that is where our species was born. Try to imagine the world. Try to imagine the world as it was when our species appeared. There were still woolly mammoths on the planet. There were saber-toothed tigers, giant moa birds, and sloths all over North America. The world was a very different place. If we were to take a time machine and go back 150,000 years and park above the Rift Valley in Africa, we would see animals in abundance and variety beyond anything that we could see in Africa today. And we'd have to look very, very carefully to spot those clusters of 3, 4, or 5 of those funny-looking two-legged furless apes. And that was us. Now, you got to admit, when you think of us in that context, we weren't very impressive. I mean, there weren't very many of us. We weren't very big. We weren't very fast. An elephant can outrun the fastest human on earth. We weren't very strong. A chimpanzee weighing 100 pounds could clean my clock, and I suggest every one of you. And we certainly weren't endowed with any, look at the number of us with glasses. We weren't endowed with special senses of vision or hearing or smell. You got to say, what the heck did we have going for us? I'm sure no other species looked at us and began to shake and said, "What's that naked ape, man? They're going to take over the planet." Of course, the reason we were so undistinguished was that our secret was hidden. It was invisible. It was a 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls. It was the human brain that more than compensated for our lack of physical and sensory abilities. That brain endowed us with a massive memory. No other mammal on the planet has the memory capacity of a human brain. We were curious and we were inventive. And those qualities, memory, curiosity, and inventiveness, more than compensated for the other things we didn't have. That brain remembered from experience, learned through trial and error, and created new ideas that it put into practice. The brain was aware of itself, self-aware in space and time, as no other creature was. We could dream of a world yet to come, a future in which we could avoid dangers and exploit opportunities. Foresight was our great leg up, our great advantage. By looking ahead, we could imagine a future and then work towards achieving it. In only 150,000 years, that strategy worked and brought us to a complete position of dominance. We occupied every planet, and we are now the ruling species on Earth. Consider our numbers. 10,000 years ago, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, it's estimated there were 10 million human beings on the entire planet. But with agriculture, we then exploded, and in only 8,000 years, by the time Jesus Christ is thought to have been born, there were now 10 times as many, 100 million human beings. And then in less than 2,000 years, in the early 1800s, we reached the first 1 billion people on the planet. And we today, in less than 200 years since we reached 1 billion, have now achieved 6.9 billion human beings on Earth. We are now the most numerous mammalian species on the planet. There's a simple rule in biology that our population number of a given species is inversely related to its physical size. In other words, the smaller you are, the more of you there can be. And that makes a lot of sense. The smaller you are, you don't need as much of anything. You can occupy a given area of land with a much larger population. As you get bigger in size, then there are fewer and fewer of you. By the time you get to whales or elephant species, now the numbers reach about in the tens of thousands. Human beings are the most numerous mammalian species on Earth. We're not a tiny animal, we're in between. We have now broken through this biological principle through trade and through technology. We are now the most numerous mammalian species, and just the act of living. Every one of us has to breathe the air. We have to drink water, eat food, clothe and shelter ourselves. Just staying alive, because there are so many of us, means that we have a very big ecological footprint. It takes a lot of land, air, and water to keep our species going. But of course, we're not like mice or rats or rabbits. We have an enormous amount of technology used on our behalf. Just look at each other and look at the clothing that we wear. I'm sure none of you is growing animals to slaughter and get the leather for your shoes, or growing cotton fields in your backyard, or flocks of sheep for wool. We have an enormous amount of technology just to deliver our clothing to us. And then you think of the food that we get that comes from all over the world. And then you think of the TVs and computers and cars. Every one of us, just to live the way that we live now here in Perth, requires a huge amount of technology applied on our behalf. So that amplifies our ecological footprint beyond any other species that has ever existed. And it doesn't end there. Ever since the end of World War II, we've been afflicted with an incredible appetite for stuff. We love to shop. And all of that stuff comes out of the earth. And when we're finished with it, we'll go back into the earth. And that escalates again our ecological footprint. And now we have a global economy that uses the entire planet as a source of raw materials, uses the entire planet to dump our toxic emissions and to pour our wastes when we're finished with these products. And that again increases our footprint. And the global economy hides the ecological impact of all of that productivity on the planet. We go to a store to buy a cotton shirt. I'm sure there are very few of you that ask, gee, is this cotton shirt organic? Cotton is one of the most chemically intensive crops that we grow. And if you go to the Orient, to where the Soviet Union decided to become the largest cotton growing area on the planet, and they did, and now you go to around the Aral Sea, around Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of those countries around the Aral Sea, it's an ecologic and a social disaster because they grew cotton in massive amounts. We just buy a cotton shirt, put it on, and we don't think anything of it. You buy a computer, a car, a television set. You don't reflect on the fact there are many, many different metals in these products. Mining is one of our most destructive activities. Do we buy a car and say, gee, where did all the metals in the car come from? What was the impact of all that mining on the local ecosystems? What about the miners? Were they sick? Were they getting a decent wage? What about the communities that support that mining operation? Are they okay? We don't ask any of those questions. We just want our product. We want to use it and get going. And yet the very act of buying these products has repercussions that extend around the world. But when you add these factors all up, when you add up our numbers, our technological muscle power, our consumptive appetite, and our global economy, We have become a force as has never existed in the 4 billion years that life has been on this earth. We are now altering the physical, chemical, and biological features of the planet on a geological scale. Not long ago, a few decades ago, we referred to tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, drought, and forest fires as natural disasters or acts of God. But they aren't anymore. The human imprint is there in all of these events. They're not natural anymore. And human beings have tried to take our place among the gods without God's knowledge to be able to manage the impact of what we are doing. Scientists divide the history of Earth into different epochs, periods of geological time. You know, the Eocene, the Holocene, the Miocene, Pleistocene, and so on. And Paul Crutzen, a Nobel Prize winner, says that this should be called the Anthropocene epoch, a time when human beings have now become a geological force. But now we have scientists and supercomputers to tell us, to look ahead, to act in the best tradition of human beings, using our knowledge and experience to dream of a world, to see the future, see where we're going. And for over 40 years, the leading scientists of the world have been telling us we are headed down a very dangerous path, that there are opportunities from switching directions and finding another road. But now, at this moment when we have become so powerful, we are turning our backs on the very survival strategy of our species. We've got to come to grips with the immensity of our power and our impact on the planet. Even now, I meet people who say, human beings couldn't possibly affect weather and climate. We're not that powerful. We have to be able to see the world as it really is and see our place in that world. And here, it's a very difficult challenge. You see, each of us looks at the world, and we see the world through our own personal experiences, through our own biases and values. Gender, race, religion, socioeconomic class, these all shape the way we perceive the world. A few years ago, I went to a village high up in the mountains of the Andes in Peru, and I learned that the children there are taught that that mountain is an Apu. Apu in their language means a god. And as long as that Apu casts its shadow on the village, it will determine the fate of all of the people in that village. Imagine how those children, when they grow up, treat that mountain. Compared to a kid in Kimberley who's taught all his life, I'll bet that mountain's full of gold and silver. The way we see the world shapes the way we treat it. In the 1980s, I was asked by a woman named Ruby Dunstan, chief of the Lytton Indian Band, if I would help her prevent logging in their sacred valley. The British Columbia government had given Fletcher Challenge, a New Zealand forest company, a permit to log in that valley that the Lytton people regarded as theirs. So I agreed to help her, and the first thing she did was to take me in a helicopter, and we flew up the valley so she could show me what we were going to fight to protect. And as we flew up the valley, she pointed out the sacred burial sites in the cliffs above the river. She showed me where there were vast stretches of bushes where the grizzly bears and the people go to collect or gather their berries in the summertime. She showed me where the spawning gravels were for the salmon, and a site up the valley where her people had fought a neighboring tribe over 200 years ago. When we landed, the helicopter pilot just shook his head. He said, "This is amazing. Last week, I took a group of foresters and politicians up this same valley. We went up the same route, and all they talked about were board feet, volumes of wood for pulp, jobs, and profit." Two groups of people looking down on the very same forest and seeing fundamentally different things. The way we see the world shapes the way we treat that world. Is a forest a sacred grove, or is it just timber and pulp? Is a river the veins of the land, or just an opportunity for irrigation and power? Is another species our biological kin, or simply a resource or a commodity? Is our house a home, or is it just a piece of real estate? I can't emphasize enough the way that we see the world shapes our behavior towards that world. And something has fundamentally shaped or altered our perception over the last century. For most of human existence, we were a local tribal animal. We didn't have to worry whether there were people on another side of an ocean, across a mountain, or over a desert. We just had to worry about our tribal territory and our tribe. Even by 1900, when there were only 1.5 billion human beings in the world, there were only 16 cities with more than 1 million people. London was the largest city with 6.5 million people. Tokyo was the 7th largest city with 1.5 million people. Most people in the world in 1900 lived in rural village communities. Most people in the world were involved in some aspect of agriculture. We were farmers, and farmers understand that we are absolutely dependent on weather and climate for how well we do in the year. In Canada, farmers know that the amount of moisture in the soil in the summer is directly related to the amount of snow we get in the winter. Farmers know that insects are absolutely critical to pollinate flowering plants, that certain species of plants can take nitrogen out of the air and fix it as fertilizer in the soil. Farmers understand that we are deeply embedded in the natural world and utterly dependent on it. Go ahead only 100 years to the year 2000. Now there were 4 times as many humans on the planet, 6 billion of us, but now there were more than 400 cities with more than 1 million people. Tokyo was the largest city in the world with 26 million people. Can you imagine? If you've ever been to Tokyo, you know human beings shouldn't have to live that way. Now the 10 largest cities in the world all had more than 11 million people, and in countries like Canada and Australia, over 85% of us now live in big cities. And in a big city, it would appear that we're different from any other species. We're so smart. We create our own habitat. Who needs nature? We don't need nature. As long as there are parks out there, we can go camping in the summer. We don't need nature. We create our own habitat. I have a friend in Toronto, the largest city in Canada, who lives in a high-rise apartment on the outskirts of the city. It's a totally air-conditioned. He takes the elevator down to the basement in the morning, gets into his air-conditioned car, drives down the freeway to a commercial building in downtown Toronto, goes up to his office, completely air-conditioned. That building is connected through a whole series of tunnels to huge shopping malls and food marts. And he told me, I don't have to go outside for weeks on end. In a city, then, who needs nature? Our most fundamental priority is our job, because with our job, we earn the money that we can buy the things that we want. And so in a city, our perception changes, and we think of the economy as our highest priority. We forget then that we are first and foremost animals. I was in Texas, Austin, Texas, a few years ago. There were a group of children in the front rows, and I said, now, if you remember one thing out of my lecture, please remember we are animals. Man, did their parents get pissed off at me. Don't you call my child an animal. We're human beings. We think that we are somehow different from the other creatures. You can see it if you call someone a chicken or a pig or a monkey or a snake. You know, we look down on other species, and we forget what Aboriginal people know and try to tell us, that we are created by Mother Earth. They don't mean that metaphorically or poetically. They literally mean the earth is our mother, because we are created by the 4 sacred elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And we forget that in the city. The first thing that every one of us needed the minute we left our mother's body, was a breath of air. That first breath had to inflate our lungs and then announce we have arrived on this planet. And from that point on till the last breath we take before we die, we need air. And we don't even think about it. I want you for the next couple of minutes to think about that simple act. 2 to 3 liters of air deep down into the most intimate, moist, warm parts of our bodies, our lungs. If you've ever seen a freshly killed animal and looked at the lungs or touched it, you know, it's that kind of mushy, squishy, yucky, funny feeling thing. Well, lungs feel funny because they're mainly made of air. Each of us in our lungs has about 300 million capsules or alveoli that are clustered like grapes around an alveolar duct. And we need all of those alveoli to give the surface area to come into contact with the air. If you flattened them out into 2 dimensions, they would cover a tennis court. That's how much surface area is all wrinkled up in our lungs. Each alveolus is lined with a 3-layered membrane called a surfactant. The surfactant reduces surface tension, so when the air comes into contact with it, it sticks or fuses. Instantly, carbon dioxide rushes out of our bodies. Oxygen and whatever else is in the air rushes into our bodies. Hemoglobin molecules and red blood cells grab the oxygen, and with each beat of our hearts, that oxygen is pumped to every part of our bodies. And when you breathe out, you don't exhaust all of the air in your lungs. If you did that, our lungs would collapse. About half of the air stays in your lungs even when you exhale. So the point I'm trying to make is that you can't draw a line and say air ends here and I begin there. There is no line. The air is in us, it's stuck to us, and it's circulating through our bodies. We are air. And if I am air and you are air, then I am you. The air that comes out of my nose mixes in this room very quickly, and soon every one of you is breathing the air that was in my body. We are stuck together in a matrix of air, not just with all humans on earth, but with the trees and the birds and the worms and the snakes that are all a part of that thin layer we call the atmosphere. I am air, you are air. We are each other. I want you to consider the simple thought exercise an astronomer named Harlow Shapley did many years ago. He said, I want to follow what's the fate of one breath of air. What happens to it? How do you follow a breath of air? 98% of the air is oxygen and nitrogen. You breathe it in, oxygen and nitrogen go into your bodies, and then a lot of the oxygen doesn't come back out. That's why we need air every minute for the oxygen. 80% of the air is nitrogen. Goes into your body. Some of it reacts chemically and doesn't come out of your bodies. But 1% of the air is an element called argon. Argon is an inert element. It doesn't react chemically with anything. So you breathe it in, goes into your body. You breathe it out, out it comes again. So argon is a very good, what scientists call, marker for a breath of air. 1% of the air is argon. How many atoms of argon in a breath of air? Shapley calculates 3 times 10 to the super 18. That's 3 followed by 18 zeros. 3 billion atoms of argon in one breath of air. Take it from me, that's a lot of argon. So let's suppose that we follow a breath that comes, where's Josh who introduced me? Thank you for introducing me. One breath of air coming out of Josh's nose. And within a few minutes, convection currents have taken that breath all over this room, and every one of us is breathing gazillions of argon atoms from that one original breath. But the doors open, eventually out that single breath goes across Perth, across Australia, and according to Shapley, 1 year later, wherever you are on the planet, because air is a single layer, every breath you take will have about 15 argon atoms from that one original breath taken a year before. So on that basis, Shapley calculates every breath you take has millions of argon atoms that were once in the bodies of Joan of Arc and Jesus Christ. That every breath you take has millions of argon atoms that were in the bodies of dinosaurs 65 million years ago. That every breath you take will suffuse life forms as far as we can see into the future. We breathe out carbon dioxide, and within a year, every leaf and every needle of a tree will carry carbon dioxide coming from a single breath that we exhale. We breathe out 80% of the air as nitrogen, and that nitrogen then enters into the nitrogen cycle that will circulate around the planet. So air is this wonderful substance that links all of life together, that links us from the past through the present and into the future. Surely air should be thought of, as Aboriginal people see it, as sacred. We boast that we are intelligent, but what intelligent creature, knowing the role that air plays in all life on Earth, would proceed to use air as a dump for the most toxic chemicals ever created? We are air. Whatever we do to the air, we do directly to ourselves. And the same applies to the other sacred elements. We are water. Every one of us is at least 60% water by weight. And when you drink water, that body leaks water. It comes out of our skin and our eyes and our mouth and our crotch. And so we've got to keep drinking water to top up. When I drink that water, do you think that's Perth water? Of course not. I, in that one mouthful of water, have taken molecules that have come from all of the oceans of the world, evaporated from the canopies of every forest on the planet, from every grassland and wetland. Water is like air, another glue that holds us all together. We are water, and yet we use water as a toxic dump and somehow think that we will escape the consequences of that. We are the earth because every bit of our food was once alive, and most of what we eat was grown on soil, on land. We are the earth through the very creatures that we consume for our nutrition. And yet we use the earth, again, to dump our waste and toxic material. And we are fire because every bit of the energy in our bodies that we need to move and grow and reproduce is sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis, converted into chemical energy. Then we get that energy by eating the plants or eating the animals that eat the plants. And we store that chemical energy in our bodies until we need it, and then we burn those molecules and release the sunlight back out into our bodies. These then are our most fundamental needs as biological creatures. Yet we use them without a thought to absorb our wastes and toxic chemicals. Well, where does that take us then? Economics and ecology are based on the same root word, ekos, the Greek word meaning household or domain. Ecology is the study of home. Economics is the management of home. What ecologists try to do is determine what are the principles and the conditions that enable a species to survive and flourish. Not a bad bit of information that we should know. I would have thought that any group in society, any company, any group of politicians, any businesses, before undertaking any major new program would say, wait, before we do anything, what were those ecologists telling us now? What were those principles and conditions? Because we don't want to do anything that will violate those fundamental ecological principles. And yet what we have done is elevated the economy above those principles. My Prime Minister, I'm embarrassed to say, is carrying on in the tradition of Bush and Howard, and he says, we can't do anything about climate, it'll destroy the economy. So we now place in Canada the economy above the very atmosphere that keeps us alive. One of the ministers of the environment in Alberta, which is our province in Canada that is like Texas, it's the energy province. An environment minister said, those environmentalists better understand, we can't afford to do what they're demanding if we don't have a strong growing economy. So even the Minister of the Environment, whose job is to protect the environment, believes the economy is the source of everything that matters, that it must come before anything else. Let's put the eco back into economics. I'm told by politicians and business people I have to be realistic, that the economy is the bottom line. I'm sure you've heard that all over the place here in Perth. That's why I did a series on CBC this summer, 10-part radio series called The Bottom Line. Because as a scientist, I know there is a fundamentally different, more profound bottom line that is dictated by our biological nature. You see, we live in a world that is determined by certain laws and principles that we have to live with. We can't do anything about them. In physics, the first and second laws of thermodynamics tell us you cannot build a perpetual motion machine. We know their laws of gravity mean you can't have an anti-gravity machine here on Earth. We know that we can't build a rocket that will travel faster than the speed of light. These are principles that emerge from the laws of physics. And nobody tries to transcend them. We live with them. There are laws of chemistry that determine the kind of reactions that we can carry out, that limit what we can do in transforming atoms into molecules. There are diffusion constants and reaction rates, and we live with those because they are the laws and principles of chemistry. We also have laws and principles of biology, and we know that biology dictates that as biological creatures, we have an absolute need for clean air, clean water, clean soil, and clean energy and biodiversity if we are to be healthy and to survive. These are facts. These that come from the world that we live in. Other things, capitalism, free enterprise, the economy, currency, markets, these are not forces of nature, for heaven's sakes. We invented them. And they're the one thing we can do something about. We can change them. They're certainly not perfect. There's no such thing as perfection in anything humans do. And yet, it's really amazing. You can talk to some of these neoconservatives, but you mention a word like market, and suddenly it's, oh, the market, oh yes. The market, free the market. If we have free markets, everything will be fine. What kind of nonsense is this, for God's sake? We created them. It wasn't long ago that people believed in dragons and demons and monsters. They really believed in them. And by God, if we thought they were mad at us, we'd throw jewels and gold and anything to placate them. Well, today we know those are figments of our imagination. Nobody believes in dragons or demons. But what do? We replace them with another figment of our imagination called the economy. And by God, we react every bit as much. If we think the economy's in trouble, boy, we'll pour money into them, anything, to get them back, to get the economy back going again. But we invented it, for God's sake. Why do we sanctify the economy and the market as if somehow they are untouchable? In 2008, we had a global economic meltdown. And that crisis was a huge opportunity. When you have a crisis, that's the moment to sit back and say, wait a minute now. What the hell went on here? We can't afford to have this happen again. We can't afford to have a dot-com boom and a bust, and then a housing boom and a bust. Let's get this right and do something about it. But no, what happened? Mr. Bush and then Mr. Obama began to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into the very banks that created the crisis, into the auto sector without any strings attached. And all they asked was, please, please, please get back up running again and keep on growing. Wasn't it Einstein that said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? We cannot continue to treat the market and the economy as if somehow they are inviolate, because they have become unbelievably destructive. We compound the problem of this human-created, flawed thing called the economy by constructing other things. Human constructs, we draw borders around our property, around our cities, around our states, around our countries. And by God, we take those borders seriously. We'll go to war, fight, kill, and die to protect those borders. But you know what? Nature couldn't give two hoots about human borders. You know, I was in Alberta a few weeks ago, and I said, I couldn't care less what you do with the tar sands, the dirtiest oil on the planet. You can do anything you want as long as that stuff only stays within Alberta air. Do you think there's such a thing as air that belongs to your province? So how can we think that our borders matter when air is a single unit around the earth? Water doesn't stop at human borders. It cartwheels around the planet. We get dust and seeds that are blown from Africa all the way across to North America. Do you think that dust stops at the border and says, I got to have a visa to get into North America? Doesn't care about our borders. And then you think about animals, insects, birds, fish, mammals that don't stop at a border because they're Canadian animals. They behave according to different principles. And yet, look at what happens then. Copenhagen, December of last year, 192 countries, all trying to deal with what is a single entity, the atmosphere, through the lenses of 192 national borders. And then we make it even worse by saying each country has its own economic priorities. So we use economics and our national borders as the highest priority in negotiating with the atmosphere. Of course it failed miserably. It's bound to fail. And these kinds of arrangements can never work so long as we elevate human constructs above the natural world that we depend on. Yet we try it all the time. Whenever we have an economic meltdown, we ask nature to pay the price. We try to shoehorn nature into our economic priorities. In British Columbia, where I live, we have a law that says you can't export raw logs out of the province. That's because we want to add the value to those logs in our own province. But the minute there's an economic downturn, the government always says to the forest industry, okay, you can cut down more trees and ship those raw logs anywhere you want. We need the revenue. Or we say to the fishing industry, oh yeah, I know we're at the sustainable level, but you can catch more because we've got to get that money coming into the economy. Or we tell the polluting company, okay, we'll relax our pollution standards because I know that costs more money. We always ask nature to fit our flawed economic systems, and it just won't work. An economy is made possible by the biosphere. It gives us everything that we use in our economy. Everything, the raw materials, come from the earth. And when we're finished with it, we throw it back into the earth. And that's a very, very thin layer. The biosphere is the source of our wealth. It's what makes an economy work. Yet the economic system ignores or discounts many of the services that ecosystems around the planet perform to keep us healthy and flourish. I once had a confrontation with the CEO of a very large forest company in Canada. And he was not very happy with me. We were screaming at each other. And finally, in frustration, he said to me, listen, Suzuki, are tree huggers like you willing to pay to protect those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay money to protect those trees, they don't have any value till someone cuts them down. And that's when I realized that was an epiphany for me. In our economic system, he was absolutely right. You see, the forest we were arguing over, as long as it's standing and intact, is taking carbon dioxide out of the air, putting oxygen back in it. Not a bad service for an animal like us. If plants in the oceans and on land don't do that, we're dead. But economists are so smart, they say that's not an important part of the economy. They call that an externality. That's why you try to put a price on carbon. Man, the screaming that goes on, because we want to use the atmosphere as a free thing. We don't want to pay money to dump stuff into the atmosphere. That forest, as long as it's standing, is pumping millions of gallons of water out of the soil, transpiring it into the air and modulating weather and climate, an externality. The forest is providing pollinators, mammals, birds, insects that pollinate all of the flowering plants on the land. And that is, to an economist, an externality. That forest is holding the soil, so when it rains, the soil doesn't run into the spawning gravels of the salmon, an externality. Think of all the species that survive and flourish in an intact forest. Economists don't care about that. That's an externality. So all of the things that forest is doing that keeps the planet habitable for an animal like us, economists dismiss as irrelevant. You have to ask, what planet is that economy designed for? Because it sure as hell isn't the planet that I depend on. What kind of a fundamentally flawed system is this that fails to take into account nature's services on which we absolutely depend for our survival? The minute I landed in Australia a week and a half ago, what do I hear? The Murray-Darling watershed, and all this arguing about we need the water for irrigation and we've been promised this and that. Nobody is saying, wait a minute now, the health of that watershed, the health of that great system is what we depend on, not only for our wealth, but our survival. That's got to come before everything else. And this is the challenge that we face, that we have an absolutely flawed economic system, and then we compound the problem. This thing that we all look up to, that say it's our highest priority, we compound the problem by enshrining growth as our highest priority, our most urgent need. Growth, think about it. What does growth do for us? Growth by itself is just a description of the state of a system. How can growth be the very purpose that governments exist or that businesses exist for? Growth does nothing for us. It's just a means to some other end. And yet we've ensconced the notion that growth is the very definition of progress. Ask any politician or company executive how well they did last year, and within seconds, they'll talk about whether the economy, the GDP, market share, jobs, profit, whether they grew or did not grow. And that becomes the definition of how well they did the year before. Growth has become the very definition of progress. Nobody wants to impede progress. But if growth is what progress is about, we don't ask the important questions. What the hell is an economy for? Are there no limits? How much is enough? Are we happier with all this stuff that comes out of this economic system that serves consumption? We don't ask those questions. We just want growth, period. And this is sheer lunacy. Nothing in a finite world can grow forever. Take our bodies. Each of our bodies has on average about 100 trillion cells. That's a 1 followed by 14 zeros. That's a lot of cells. We're losing cells from our body and our hair, and our blood cells are dying and skin cells being shed all of the time. But if 1 out of 100 trillion, that is insignificant. One cell out of 100 trillion says, I'm going to divide forever. I'm not going to stop. I live in a big body. You know very well. Long before that cell has created a very significant mass, if you don't get rid of it, it'll kill you. Cancer attempts to grow forever, and the result is death. We live within the biosphere. The biosphere is the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. It's fixed, it can't grow. Carl Sagan, the late astronomer, told us that if you shrink the Earth to the size of a basketball, the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where 30 million species live, would be thinner than a layer of varnish that you paint on that basketball. That's it. That's our home, and nothing within that layer of varnish can grow forever. Now, I'm going to show you why this constant demand for growth is suicidal. Anything growing steadily over time, whether it's the size of your city, the amount of garbage you make, the amount of water you use, the number of people, anything growing steadily over time is called exponential growth. And anything growing exponentially has a predictable doubling time. So if it's growing at 1% a year, it'll double in 70 years. 2% a year, it'll double in 35 years. 3%, 24 years. 4%, 17 and a half years. Anything growing steadily will have a predictable doubling time. I'm going to give you a system analogous to the planet. I'm going to give you a test tube full of food for bacteria. That's the Earth. And I'm going to put one bacterial cell in it, and that's us. And that bacterial cell is going to go into exponential growth. It's going to divide every minute. Okay? So at time 0, there's one cell in the test tube. In 1 minute, there are 2. 2 minutes, there are 4. 3 minutes, there are 8. 4 minutes, 16. That's exponential growth. And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely packed with bacteria, and there's no food left. Okay? It's a 60-minute growth cycle. When is the test tube only half full? And of course, the answer is at 59 minutes. 59 minutes, it's only half full, and 1 minute later, it's completely full, right? So at 58 minutes, it's 25% full. 57 minutes, it's 12.5% full. At 55 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, it's 3% full. So if at 55 minutes, one of the bacteria says, hey guys, I've been thinking, we got a population problem. The other bacteria would say, Jack, what the hell have you been smoking, man? 97% of the test tube's empty, and we've been around for 55 minutes. They'd be 5 minutes away from filling it, so bacteria are no smarter than people. 59 minutes, they go, oh my God, Jack was right. We got 1 minute left. What the hell are we going to do now? Don't give any money to those economists. Give it to those scientists. And by God, in less than a minute, those scientists invent 3 more test tubes full of food for bacteria. They quadruple the amount of food in space. That would be like us discovering 3 planet Earths right nearby we could start using immediately. So they're saved, right? So what happens? At 60 minutes, the first test tube's full. 61 minutes, the second's full. 62 minutes, all 4 are full. By quadrupling the amount of food in space, you buy 2 extra minutes. How can we add even a fraction of 1% more of air, water, soil, biodiversity to the planet? We can't. It's fixed. It's the biosphere. You can't grow it. And every scientist I've talked to agrees with me. We're already past the 59th minute. So all of this discussion about more is we've got to accelerate what is a suicidal path. Do you guys need more? Are you so bad off in Perth you've got to have more? I mean, how much more do we need? Why are all these politicians saying we've got to have more when it's taking us on a suicidal path? When I say this in front of politicians and business people, they get very, very angry at me. How dare you say we're past the 59th minute? Look at our stores, they're filled with stuff. Look at our people, we're living longer, we're healthier. How dare you say that? I say it without apology. We have created the illusion that everything is all right by using up the rightful legacy of our children and our grandchildren. You don't have to believe me. Ask anyone who's lived in Perth over the last 80 or 90 years. Ask them, what was it like here when you were a kid? Oh yeah, there are a lot of cars and fridges and televisions and all those things, but ask them, what was it like in the surrounding area? I've been to the Amazon, to the heart of the Amazon, to the Serengeti, to the Arctic. And when I go to these places, I try to find the oldest person in the village to say, what was it like when you were 5 or 6 years old? And everywhere, including in the middle of the Amazon, the answer is terrifyingly similar. It used to be so different. There used to be trees as far as you could see. The air used to be black with birds at certain times of the year. The rivers used to be jammed with fish. All over the world, our elders are a living record of enormous changes that have happened in the span of a single human life. We Americans are always saying, well, there's plenty more where that came from. There isn't plenty more where that came from. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth has been fully occupied and fully developed by 30 million species. If we drive plants or animals out of the places that we live, there isn't empty space where they can go and inhabit somewhere else. If they're not here, they're not anywhere. Well, Americans say that's the price of progress. I don't think it's progress to use up the rightful legacy of our children and grandchildren. That is a weird definition of progress, if you ask me. We know in our guts that something is wrong, even though the media will try to hide it from you. You know, I landed in Australia and every big headlines, Australian dollar reaches parity with the American dollar. Oh, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that fantastic? Your dollar is so strong. Meanwhile, on the same week, there was a report that 20% of all plant species could be extinct by the middle of this century. In our papers in Canada, buried on page 18 in a 6-inch column. What the hell is going on? You know, anything to do with the economy, banner headlines. Anything to do with the state of the planet that keeps us alive, buried somewhere, and a one-day wonder in the newspapers. We know something's wrong. Oceans cover 70% of the planet. They're a mess. We've used them as a garbage can. There are islands of plastic in the Pacific Ocean bigger than the state of Texas. There are dead zones where nothing lives, growing in size, duration, and number in every ocean on Earth. We know that if we continue fishing and polluting as we are now, that by 2050 there will not be a single commercial species of fish left on the planet. And now, with increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide is dissolving in the oceans as carbonic acid, acidifying the oceans with consequences ecologists tell us are terrifying. 80% of the forests on the land have been fragmented and destroyed. If we continue at the rate we're going today, in 20 years, there will not be a single large intact forest left on the planet. We've used air, water, and soil to dump our toxic chemicals, and I know what a wonderful place Perth is, but every one of you is filled with dozens of toxic chemicals and over a pound of plastic dissolved in your bodies. And we know that climate is changing and that burning fossil fuels is at the heart of it. So here we are. As a species, we've shown ourselves to be incredibly inventive and clever. But we've lacked the humility to realize there are limits and that we don't know enough to manage the biosphere. So I think that this moment we have to ask, what the heck is life all about? My great hero and teacher, my mentor, was my father. And in 1994, when he was 85, he was dying of cancer. I moved in to live with him the last month of his life. He was fully prepared to die. He was not afraid of it. And we had, I think, the happiest time of my life was that last month. We laughed and cried and pored over scrapbooks and talked and talked and talked. Every night my wife would come with my children and slides of pictures of trips that we'd taken together with my dad. And he kept saying over and over, David, I die a rich man. My father was never a wealthy person. But he kept saying, I will die a rich man. In all that month that I lived with him, he never once said, gee, do you remember that closet full of fancy clothes I had? You remember that car I bought in 1987? Or the big house that we owned on Broughdale Lane? All we talked about were family, friends, and neighbors, and the things that we did together. That was my father's wealth. And in those things, he was truly a wealthy man. We've got often some weird idea about what life is all about. A few years ago, in the 1990s, before Hong Kong reverted to China, I got a letter in the mail from a real estate agent Now, my wife and I now have lived in the same place for over 35 years. We live right on the water in Vancouver. If you've ever visited our city, you know it's one of the most beautiful cities in North America, and we have one of the most lovely places. And I got a letter saying, offshore money is pouring into Vancouver. Now is the time for you to sell your property and buy up. I'd never heard the use of the word buy up in that way. I didn't know you bought a house in order to invest in it so that you can eventually sell it, make more money, and get a bigger or better piece of land. I thought you bought a place to make it your home. Well, I was really very angry to receive this letter. And so I thought, all right, Mr. Real Estate Agent, if I'm going to put my home on the market, what would I list as the things that gave it the highest value to me? And so the first thing I put down was the fact that when we bought the house, we moved my wife's mother and father into the upstairs to live with us. So my children have had grandma and granddad upstairs their entire lives. And I put that down as something very, very worthwhile for me. My father was a carpenter, and when Tara and I were first married, he built a kitchen cabinet for our apartment. When we bought this house, I tore that cabinet out and installed it in our kitchen. Looks like hell there, doesn't fit. But every time I use that cabinet, my father is there, and I put that down. My best friend came out to stay with us for a week when I was building a fence along the waterside, and he spent days carving a handle for the gate. And every time I use that gate, I think of my best friend, and I put that down as something of great value. When my father-in-law planted a beautiful clematis plant along the side of the gate, and when my mother died, we put Mom's ashes onto that plant. And when my niece Janice died unexpectedly, we put her ashes on that plant. And every year, when the beautiful flowers, the purple flowers appear above the gate, I know that my mom and my niece are there. And I put that down. My children have dragged dead snakes and squirrels and birds off the street and made a little animal cemetery under our dogwood tree. And I put that down. And as I look over that list, I realize that those are the things that have transformed my property into a home. And those are things that, to me, are priceless. And yet, on the market, those things are absolutely worthless. And I think of Aboriginal people around the world who see the earth as sacred because she is our mother, for whom rocks and rivers and forests and soil are sacred. How do you put a value on something that is sacred? And that's a problem when we evaluate everything in economic terms. Those things that matter most to us have no value at all in our economic system. Somehow we've got ourselves into thinking that we need more and more, bigger and better, more recent, more modern, and that's going to make us happy. And yet we know in our hearts that's not true. So what then at this moment is the challenge? First of all, slow down. What the hell is the rush? We're all going to die anyway. We're just rushing to drop off the end. Slow down. Get to know each other. Think about our children and grandchildren and ask what we're going to leave them. And then get on with the most important part. We have to reimagine the future. Our great ability was imagination, which enabled us to dream of the world yet to come, to dream of something we could try to achieve. And once we have that dream, we can work to achieve it. That's what we've done since the beginning of our species. Imagine a world where we live, work, and play in the same area. So we don't need a car. We want to go outside because that's where all the fun and the action is. Imagine where the streets and houses and roads all have the ability to trap every bit of sunlight falling on it to convert it into electricity. Imagine every roof capturing water and growing food. Imagine our cities filled with orchards of fruit and nut trees and community gardens so we can celebrate the seasons through the various plants that mature over the year. Imagine extracting heat from the earth in the winter and putting heat back down into the earth in the summer. Imagine cancer and asthma rates plummeting because we no longer put toxics into our surroundings. Imagine zero production of waste because we design industrial systems like nature, where one species' waste is another species' opportunity. Imagine, as I did when I was a kid, drinking the water out of any river or lake. In Canada, when you catch a fish, you now have to consult a big book to find out what chemicals are in it and how much you can eat each week. Imagine catching a fish and eating it without worrying about what's in it. Imagine in Australia with rich forests that can be logged forever because we're logging them the right way. Imagine lighter than airships that transport massive payloads at very little emission. Imagine taking tourists on wonderful trips across the earth at a speed that makes Earth sense. Imagine an economy that is in balance with nature's productive capacity, that incorporates nature's services into it. I could go on and on. I've only hinted at some of the possibilities, but these are not pie in the sky dreaming of stuff like carbon capture and storage. These are all actually things that are going on in different ways in different parts of the world. These can be done. They are being done. So let us dream of what is possible so that we can come together and put our efforts into working towards that dream. And then let us show what we are truly capable of as a species. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Now, as Josh said, there are mics. There's one there, I can see one there. I don't know if there are any others, but I can answer a few questions. But if you're all shy, I'll just go out and sign books. Can we turn on the mic? Okay, I think you're live.
Hello. Hello, David. My name is Damush, and I really love you. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love your ideas, and I love what you said. And I've been living in Perth for 10 years, and I would like to know why you're actually coming to Perth. Because with all what you said, this is Josh presented you before or presented Perth saying it is the most unsustainable city in Australia. We have so many things going wrong here. Why are you actually coming to Perth?
Isn't that why you need me here?
I know. I thank you for that, but yeah, do you see something else than I do? But yeah.
Well, I love coming to Perth. The people that I've met, I've loved Australia ever since I came here in 1988. And you live in an absolutely wonderful part of the planet. And right now, my job is, as an elder, trying to take a few ideas that I can leave. You've got to solve it. You've got to begin the discussion. I just try to throw a bit of catalyst in there. What I see myself and my foundation, I hope you've picked up the literature about our foundation. One of our first projects that we carried out was in Tasmania. We did a project trying to see whether or not we could take down the Pedder Dam and restore that ecosystem. And I hope you will look at one of the most important legacies I leave is my foundation. And we are now trying to reach out and identify people in different communities across Canada and I hope in Australia, where people are anxious to do something, as you expressed right now. And we will then take people from communities and train them on how do we begin the discussion, what kind of tools and resources are available to do that discussion in communities. So our slogan is, we want to motivate the motivated to motivate. And that's our job, and so go to our website, please, davidsuzuki.org, and we are beginning this outreach, setting up ambassadors wherever we can to begin the discussion. All of the answers are here. You know, and one thing that Tara and I, my wife and I, thought years ago is, we're just a drop in the bucket, like we're nothing, we're insignificant. But we created a foundation where we have dozens of staff members who are being paid a decent wage, and we have hundreds of volunteers who put in a huge amount of their time, and we have tens of thousands of people who support us with money. We don't take government or corporate money. We depend on ordinary people. And boy, suddenly 2 people have become quite large. Looking in this room, I'm blown away. I now deputize all of you as ambassadors for my foundation, and think, this is just you. Think of your families. Think of your friends and people that believe in you. This is a very big tent. This is a huge force.
Hello, my name's Anton, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Suzuki, for coming and visiting us in Perth. I'm not sure so much if this is a question, but it is in its own right. Every day, or not every day, but on some given days, I travel home from work and I contemplate what role it is that I play as part of humanity and trying to get out of the rat race. You know, I'm an ambitious person. I'm trying to build a business. I'm trying to put myself in a position where I'm going to be able to support a family. But at that same time, I'm thinking, what is it that I am doing, or what is it that I'm not doing that's going to sustain our ability to be able to live long into the future? And I suppose the question that I ask is, what can I do right now to change so I can...
Well, I mean, you have to look at your own life and lifestyle and the way you consume. I get a lot of young people that say, how do I become an environmentalist? I want to make a difference. And this is a total mistaken way to approach it. I say, follow your passion. If you're a musician, if you're a poet, if you're a plumber or garage mechanic, follow your passion. But every aspect of society has to be fundamentally driven into balance with our surroundings. We can't make the environmentalism a profession. That's why I told Bob Brown a couple of days ago, you know, in the long run, I don't want there to be a Green Party. Because the minute you have a Green Party, it implies the other parties are worried about other things, and the Greenies will worry about the environment. That's not the way it should be. It should be through every aspect of society. Whatever you do, we've got to make that green. We need, at this time, you know, there are all kinds of suggestions about what you can do. On our website, we've got the Nature Challenge, the 10 most effective things that each of us can do to lighten our ecological footprint. And, and these are very useful. They're very simple, but they're very effective if enough of us do it. But that's not going to get us on a different path. All that does is it slows us down. I use the metaphor that I feel we're in a giant car heading at a brick wall at 100 miles an hour, and everybody's arguing about where they want to sit. Doesn't matter who's driving. Someone's got to say, put the brakes on and turn the wheel. But those of us that are saying it, we're locked in the boot. Nobody hears us anyway. So we've got to slow down, but we've got to also get off the path. How do you do that? We need big decisions being made by government. We are a democracy, and we've now got to make this issue of sustainability an absolute integral part of what governments are doing. And it's not going to be simple stuff. If people, there are a lot of Greens who think, well, if we just become more efficient, if I carry a cloth bag, if I change all the light bulbs and drive a Prius, everything will be fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, we're really in deep trouble. And it's going to have to be fundamentally different. If you think that you're going to absolutely need to have an iPhone 5 and an iPhone 6 and an iPad 3 and all this stuff, forget it. Absolutely forget it. We are so high above the capacity of the planet to carry us. It means that we're going to have to shuck off so much of this hyper-consumptive way of living and focus on relationships. I'm sorry, I'm not helping you in terms of what you do, but this is what we've got to be thinking.
Hello? Yep. Hi, Alfred. I think you might agree, and my question has kind of changed since the last few questions. You might agree that you are, in a way, preaching to the converted here in this room. It's the politicians, they don't seem to get or they can't have the
I never
power.
understand that you are preaching to the converted thing. So what's wrong with preaching to the converted? This is
nothing.
There's 2,000 people here. Don't tell me this is an insignificant force. You exist in a democracy we don't have in Canada. In Canada, half our public isn't even bothering to vote. You've got to vote. You've got a real democracy, and this is a hell of a significant group. I'm happy to talk to the converted if this is... So what's the problem? We can make it something when you think of all the people here.
That is true, and I do get the idea that one person can make a change, but how do we make it fast enough?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know. I've just finished on this trip reading Clive Hamilton's book, Requiem for a Species. Clive is one of your most eminent thinkers about environmental issues. And this is a devastating book. There's nothing in his book I disagree with. And he's saying it's too late. Jim Lovelock, who coined the expression Gaia, says it's too late. And it's devastating. Their critiques are right on. But my response is slightly different. Everything is looking very, very bad. But I don't think anyone has a right to say it's too late because we don't know enough to say it's too late. You know, I think nature has got a lot of surprises yet to come. A lot of them are not going to be very pleasant. But let me just mention one thing that has just uplifted me. Sockeye salmon are the most prized species of salmon in North America. The biggest sockeye salmon run in the world is in the Fraser River in Canada. Last year, we like to have a sockeye salmon run of the order of 20 to 30 million fish in a season. Last year, just over 1 million sockeye came back, and I really thought that was it, that they're done. The government set up a commission to investigate what the hell happened to sockeye salmon. This year, 1 year later, we got the biggest run of sockeye salmon in 100 years. 35 million came back. Nobody has a clue what the hell happened. I am absolutely sure sockeye salmon are not out of the woods. But what it showed is, holy cow, nature was far more forgiving than we ever deserved. So let's give her a chance and hope that nature will be more forgiving.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.